Yo, what's up everybody? It's International Master Daniel Rensch here via the Chess.com YouTube channel once again. Today I wanted to take a break from the videos I've been doing in our chess openings playlist, as well as the live sessions matches, to bring you a game that is a personal favorite of mine. A game that's highly instructive and enjoyable to watch and replay, and a game that I took to memorizing when I was building my own opening repertoire as a young player, and hopefully maybe offer some advice as to why this game was worth memorizing in the openings that I was choosing to play. Before we go any further and give you any advice in regards to why I felt this game was important for me to memorize and, of course, why it's enjoyable, let's jump right in and review the game Geller-Euwe from the Zurich International Interzonal Tournament of 1953, the tournament which would decide who would challenge Botvinnik in the next World Championship match, and a tournament that was eventually went on to be won by Vasily Smyslov in his first challenge for the World Championship match. So let's take a look at this awesome game. White plays d4, and after knight f6, c4, and e6, we have a Nimzo-Indian. The Nimzo-Indian was one of the main weapons in my repertoire, and I was looking for classical chess games to teach me the principles and the fundamental ideas of playing a Nimzo-Indian as black. And this game was recommended to me along with many of the games from this tournament, with that era in the 50s and 60s being kind of a golden era for some of the hyper-modern chess, and some of these Indian openings against d4 being the King's-Indian and the Nimzo-Indian. So, in any case, this game is highly instructive and enjoyable. Here White played the move e3, and after c5, which is technically a Hubner variation, White plays a3, and so we transpose directly back into a Zamish variation, a Zamish Nimzo-Indian, where White's intention is, though he's created these weaknesses for himself by allowing black to double his pawns, his intention is to bring the bishop to d3, bring the knight to e2 behind the pawn structure, so that he may play e4 and f4 and advance the pawns in an aggressive fashion toward the king side. We're going to see that happen in the game. Black's idea in these positions is pretty simple. He has a positional target for the rest of the game. You'll notice that Black develops the queen side with the direct idea of exposing these double pawns, while also trying to keep an eye on White's attack. If you haven't seen this game, then you're in for a real treat, because I'm not going to tell you what happened until we get to the end. After the move b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, the most common theory these days is considered to just be bishop a6 immediately, followed by knight to c6 and knight a5 with the direct assault on the pawns. Of course, Black will also be castling. But the reason is that typically bishop b7 is no longer met by f3. This move would simply be met by knight to e2, where Black is not really in a position to take this pawn on g2 without fear of the g file becoming a real issue. So at this time, the theory had not been developed that White was going to play knight to e2. So White played f3, and after knight to c6, knight e2, castles, we see knight a5, and you could argue that the time lost by both players, with Black wasting a tempo with this bishop that could have gone here, and White wasting a tempo with the pawn to go to f4, was essentially a wash, and did not really have any bearing or effect on the position we reached down the road here. White plays e4, and this is a critical moment for Nimzo-Indian players to understand that as White expands in the center and prepares to launch both bishops along these diagonals, as well as, of course, follow with the f-pawn advance and maybe even a rook lift, as White prepares to do that, he has to be very careful not to create any extra weaknesses on the king side, as any one of them could be fatal. And in that case, Black does not want to play the move h6 to stop bishop to g5, pinning the knight. As the attacks develop, you'll see that this pawn will simply be a target for White to sacrifice and to open up the black king. So rather, Black needs to deal with the threat of bishop to g5, which of course would be followed by e5, because the knight is pinned to the bishop. To the queen. He needs to prepare the move knight to e8 rather than h6. This is a very common move that, like I said, prevents bishop g5 from pinning the knight on f6, but it also potentially prepares to bring the knight around to the queen side that might eventually be important to target White's queen side weaknesses. After knight to g3, c takes d4, c takes d4, rook c8. You could argue that c takes d4 was a kind of an early commitment, but in general, the more accurate approach for white these days is considered to play f4 right away rather than moving the knight. And though this is not necessarily a theory lecture of the Nimzo-Indian, it's really to show these two very strong grandmasters play a great chess game, a classical chess game in their era. We're not going to talk too much about it, but I'll say the main two moves for black are either to play f5 or to continue with the assault on the queen side and be prepared to meet f5 with f6 to sort of use the pawns to slow down black's attack. Again, the idea with f5 would be to close in this pawn, which in turn closes in the bishop, and hopefully prepares a better defensive setup for black on the king side. So that would be the main idea, but knight to g3 was played. And so the move order itself is not necessarily the most theoretically accurate, but the position that develops after f4, black wins this pawn in f5, is very interesting because you have white sacrificing the queen side to develop this assault on the king side, which might be very dangerous. The threat of f6 to blow open the dark squares is a strong one. So black has to play f6 himself, and after the rook lift, we see that white's position is pretty intimidating. In fact, if I had to choose most of the time in a position like this, I would prefer to play white with this type of practical pressure coming against my opponent's king. However, knowing what happened in this position and knowing that black's queenside counterplay is enough to break through, I wouldn't say that white is necessarily in the best shape here, but he's kind of committed, having sacrificed the queenside, to play all out for this attack. After the move queen to b6 to attack the d4 pawn, white plays an awesome move here with the move e5, exclam, unleashing not only the bishop along the diagonal, but also unleashing the rook to defend the d4 pawn for defensive purposes. A very interesting shot. And after knight takes e5, f takes e6, it seems as though white was more than happy with the transition of the position, being able to bring all of his pieces toward the king side. Despite having lost the pawns over here, black's pieces don't seem to be coordinated well enough to create enough counterplay against the white king. So white goes full steam ahead with the move bishop h6 and prepares to break through with threats among different types of threats, but one of the main ones would be to simply bring the rook over and to eventually break through with the target on g7. Also ideas of playing takes followed by knight to h5, and again there are threats down h7. In this position, black played a great move, which eventually became considered one of the most famous deflection tactics in the history of chess. A really exciting move here, and it really kind of climaxed the game and showed that Euwe had thought just a little bit deeper than his opponent and understood that black's pieces were well coordinated enough to create an attack on the king side after one great, brilliant exclamaviach move, I would say. The move that was played, if you want to pause your videos, of course you can if you want to think about it, but the move that was played was rook to h8, exclamaviach, double exclam, forcing the white queen to capture, as retreating the queen would now, to any square that was safe, would just simply lose the bishop. So after queen takes h8, we see the whole purpose was to deflect the queen away from the c2 square, which immediately is infiltrated by the rook, and suddenly we see that the threats of the rook, the queen coming in at some point, in the bishop are enough that white's light squares are completely exposed and without defense. Very interesting to see all of white's pieces fully committed for this attack, yet completely out of play in terms of dealing with what matters. After the move rook to c1, we see rook takes g2, king f1, queen to b3, exclam, and after king to e1, queen f3, the game is essentially over, with multiple threats here, including queen f2 check, king moves, and rook to g1 mate. No moves from white here can save against these types of threats, and without creating another disaster. And white resigned. This type of game that really highlights the features of the Nimzo, particularly when we think about white's positional weaknesses being the target for black, while at the same time black must find timely defensive moves like knight to e8, is a really common theme of playing the Nimzo-Indian. So if you're wondering about what a stem game is a game that if you're playing an opening you should have memorized, because for you it highlights all the critical ideas of your opening. Let's say you're playing a Ruy Lopez, you may have some stem games by Fischer or Carries or Karpov or Kasparov, some great games that they played that you took to memorizing because you felt that those games highlighted all the critical ideas for you. And so for black to be able to break through on the queen side and find timely defensive moves like knight to e8 was a really great example of what the Nimzo-Indian is all about. Black playing, again, a move like f6, a very timely defensive move combined with aggressive intentions on the queen side. This is really what black does when he's doing well in the Nimzo-Indian, a game that I really enjoyed, a classical chess game, and I hope we just rocked your socks off, rocked your face, we just face-planted you here on the Chess.com YouTube channel. Everybody, let's just get excited. We're going to see you around on Chess.com. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.